Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and we'd love to know where you're from and what you love about our channel. Now, let's get started. A gentle breeze swept through the evening, carrying with it the scent of approaching rain. Rachel Green sat in her modest apartment, sipping a cup of chamomile tea after a grueling 12-hour shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. The city lights outside twinkled like stars that had fallen to earth, but Rachel's thoughts were far from the serene tableau. The last thing she expected on a night like this was a call that would alter the trajectory of her life forever. Her phone buzzed sharply on the coffee table, shattering the fragile tranquility of her evening. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, she would let it go to voicemail, but an inexplicable tug of intuition, compelled her to answer. "Good evening, Miss Green. My name is Ross Rufus," a deep, polished voice greeted her. "We have a job proposal to discuss." Rachel straightened in her chair, the formal tone immediately catching her attention. What kind of proposal?" she asked, her voice cautious yet curious. "Our father, Frank Rufus, has been in a vegetative state for years. We require full-time care for him at home. Your credentials come highly recommended." Rachel blinked, caught off guard. The Rufus name wasn't unfamiliar. It belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the state. Still, something about the offer felt off. "I'm flattered, but why me? Surely someone else with more specialized experience." "We're willing to pay $5,000 a month," Ross interrupted smoothly, "plus full coverage of living expenses." The figure was staggering. Rachel's mind raced. That kind of salary was practically unheard of even for private nursing. Yet the very generosity of the offer raised her suspicions. "That's very generous," she ventured. "May I ask why your family is willing to pay so much?" There was a pause on the line, one so long she almost thought the call had dropped. Then Ross replied, his voice tight, "My sister and I have our own families to care for. We simply want to ensure our father receives the best care possible." Rachel hesitated. Something about the polished veneer of Ross's explanation didn't sit right with her. But the offer was tempting, almost too tempting. Financially, it was a lifeline. Still, years of working as a nurse had taught her to trust her instincts. "I'll need some time to think it over," Rachel said, choosing her words carefully. "Of course," Ross replied smoothly, but there was an edge to his tone. "Do let us know soon. We'll send a car to bring you to the estate if you accept." As the call ended, Rachel felt a prickling sense of unease. Who were the Rufus siblings really? And what kind of secrets did their sprawling estate hold? The next morning, Rachel sat at her laptop, the blue glow of the screen illuminating her furrowed brow. Curiosity had gotten the better of her. She typed Frank Rufus into the search bar, and headlines flooded the screen. "Business mogul Frank Rufus in vegetative state after mysterious fall." Rufus siblings battle over family fortune. Behind closed doors, the dark secrets of the Rufus dynasty. Rachel's stomach churned as she scrolled through the articles. Frank Rufus, a self-made billionaire, had once dominated headlines for his ruthless business tactics. But 10 years ago, a tragic fall had left him incapacitated, or so the story went. Since then, his children, Ross and Monica, had taken over the family empire, steering it with an iron grip. Yet whispers of family discord and greed were impossible to ignore. Her mind buzzed with conflicting thoughts. The offer was still tantalizing, but now it came with a shadow of foreboding. Finally, she made her decision. If she was going to accept the job, she needed to be ready for whatever secrets the Rufus mansion held. 2 days later, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Rachel's apartment. The driver, a man in his 50s with a face etched by years of quiet service, opened the door for her. "Miss Green," he said with a polite nod, "welcome aboard." The ride to the Rufus estate was eerily silent. Rachel stared out the window as the bustling cityscape gave way to sprawling countryside, the trees standing tall and silent like sentinels. When the car finally pulled into the estate's driveway, she gasped. The Rufus mansion loomed before her, a testament to both opulence and intimidation. Its stone facade was cloaked in ivy, and towering gates stood as if to warn intruders to keep their distance. The driver escorted her to the grand entrance, where Ross Rufus awaited. He was impeccably dressed, his sharp suit and calculating gaze giving him an air of authority. Beside him stood Monica, her elegance almost predatory. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping onto a stage where everyone played a carefully rehearsed role. "Miss Green," Ross said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his smile practiced. "Welcome. Let me show you to our father." The interior of the mansion was as breathtaking as it was overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and an air of hushed grandeur. But beneath the luxury, Rachel felt an undercurrent of tension, a palpable unease that prickled her skin. Rachel was led to a sunlit room where Frank Rufus lay in a bed surrounded by medical equipment. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of stillness. She approached cautiously, her nurse's instinct kicking in. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rufus," she said softly. "I'm Rachel Green, your new nurse." To her astonishment, Frank's eyes fluttered open. He stared at her with piercing intensity, and then, to her utter disbelief, he spoke. "Welcome, Rachel," he said, his voice steady. "I've been waiting for you." Rachel staggered backward, her mind reeling. "But you're supposed to be—" Frank's gaze didn't waver. "Supposed to be unconscious, paralyzed. That's what they want you to believe." "They?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "My children," Frank said, his tone grave. "Ross and Monica. They want me dead, Miss Green, for my fortune." "And Monica, they want me dead, Miss Green, for it's because of the cancer." Rachel felt the room tilt, the weight of his words pressing down on her. This wasn't just a job. It was a deadly game, and she was now a player. Frank's confession set Rachel's heart racing. She wanted to leave, to escape the mansion and the web of danger it represented. But as she looked into Frank's eyes filled with a desperate plea for help, she knew she couldn't walk away. "I'll help you," she said, her voice firm despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "But you need to tell me everything." Frank nodded, a faint smile breaking through his solemn expression. "You're the only one I can trust." The mansion's walls seemed to close in around her as Rachel made her vow. She was no longer just a nurse. She was Frank Rufus's last hope, and as she glanced toward the hallway where Ross and Monica's voices echoed like distant thunder, she realized she had stepped into a story far darker and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The following morning, the weight of her decision fully set in as Rachel stood at the grand gates of the Rufus estate. The mansion before her seemed more alive than it had the day before, its towering facade glinting under the soft rays of the morning sun. The ivy that crawled along the stone walls looked less like a decoration and more like tendrils clutching its secrets buried within. Rachel took a deep breath, her palms clammy despite the cool breeze. This wasn't just a new job, it was the beginning of something she couldn't yet define. As she stepped through the ornate doors, a wave of warmth and luxury enveloped her. The interior was a symphony of elegance and excess. Marble floors polished to a mirror-like sheen, walls adorned with priceless art, and chandeliers that hung like crystalline constellations. Yet, beneath the glamour, Rachel felt an undercurrent of something darker, something watching. Her footsteps echoed as Ross led her down a long corridor, his pace brisk and his demeanor as meticulously controlled as the mansion itself. "You'll find the accommodations comfortable," he said without looking back, his voice crisp but devoid of warmth. "My father's room is just ahead. The staff will assist you if needed." Rachel nodded, her curiosity now tinged with unease. The deeper they ventured into the estate, the more oppressive the air felt. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the corners of the hall, their darkness deepened by the stark contrast of sunlight streaming through towering windows. Every gilded surface and ornate carving only amplified this strange duality of the house, a place so alive and yet eerily lifeless. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door. Ross turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This is where my father rests. Remember, he doesn't respond much, but we hope your presence will improve his condition. If you find the story we bring today interesting, please comment great. If you feel the story is not attractive, please comment need more drama." Rachel's heart quickened at the lie she now knew hid behind his words. She forced a polite smile, the rehearsed demeanor of a nurse masking her swirling emotions. "I'll do my best," she said softly. Ross opened the door and Rachel stepped inside. The room was unexpectedly bright, bathed in the golden glow of mid-morning light that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Plush rugs muffled her footsteps as she moved toward the grand bed at the center of the room. Frank Rufus lay motionless, his thin frame dwarfed by the enormous bed. Medical monitors hummed softly, their rhythmic beeping the only sound breaking the silence. Rachel hesitated for a moment, studying him. His features were sharp but aged, but the kind of face that once commanded rooms but now seemed weathered by years of solitude. She approached cautiously, her nursing instincts kicking in, despite the peculiar circumstances. "Good morning, Mr. Rufus," she said softly. "I am Rachel Green, your new nurse." To anyone else, Frank might have seemed utterly still, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of the ventilator. But Rachel had spent years reading the unspoken language of patients' bodies. The faint flicker in his eyelids, the slight tension in his jaw. These were signs of someone far more aware than his children would have her believe. Suddenly, his eyes opened, startling her so completely that she took a step back. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, his gaze piercing through the veil of uncertainty she carried. And then, to her astonishment, he spoke. "Welcome, Rachel," he said, his voice weak but deliberate. "I've been waiting for you." Rachel froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Waiting for her? The logical part of her mind fought against the surreal moment. This man was supposed to be in a vegetative state. She had read the reports, had seen the medical documentation, but here he was, speaking as if none of it were true. "You can talk?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank's lips curled into a faint smile. "Only to those I trust," he replied, his words carrying a gravity that sent a chill down her spine. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavy with a sense of impending revelation. Rachel pulled a chair closer to his bedside, her hands trembling as she gripped its arms. "Mr. Rufus, I don't understand. Why would anyone believe you're comatose?" Frank's smile faded, replaced by an expression of profound weariness. "Because they want me gone," he said, his tone both matter-of-fact and tinged with sorrow. "Ross and Monica, they think I don't know their plans. They've been plotting to end my life for years, Rachel, for my fortune." The words struck her like a bolt of lightning. Rachel felt her throat tighten, her pulse quicken. That's absurd," she stammered. though the conviction in his eyes made it impossible to dismiss. "It's the truth," Frank said simply. "I don't expect you to believe me yet, but you will. I need you to help me, Rachel. You're my only chance." Rachel leaned back, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Curiosity mingled with a creeping dread as she considered the enormity of what he was asking. She had taken the job to provide care, not to become entangled in a web of family betrayal and greed. And yet, there was something in Frank's gaze, a desperate, fragile hope that she couldn't ignore. I need to think," she said finally, her voice trembling. Frank nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need. But remember, time is not a luxury I have." Rachel left the room feeling as though she'd crossed an invisible threshold. The house that had once seemed merely opulent now felt alive with secrets, its grandeur a mask for something far more sinister. As she walked back toward her quarters, she passed a gilded mirror and caught her own reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the weight of what she had just learned. The distant echo of voices snapped her out of her thoughts. Peering around the corner, she saw Ross and Monica standing in the hallway, their postures stiff, their whispers hurried. They seemed unaware of her presence, their conversation carrying an undercurrent of tension that sent a shiver down her spine. "She'll do her job and stay out of it," Ross was saying, his voice low but sharp. "As long as she believes the lie, we have nothing to worry about." Monica crossed her arms, her expression icy. "And if she doesn't?" Ross's jaw tightened. "Then we'll handle her. Just like we're handling him." Rachel's breath hitched. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they would hear it. This was no ordinary family, and she was no longer an ordinary nurse. As the siblings walked away, their shadows stretching unnaturally along the corridor, Rachel made a silent vow. If Frank was telling the truth, she would find it. She had stepped into a gilded cage, and the stakes were far higher than she had ever imagined. The Rufus mansion had always been cloaked in secrets, but now, for Rachel, it felt like every shadow held a whisper, every corridor concealed a threat. The weight of Frank's revelation pressed on her mind like an invisible vice. His children wanted him dead, for his fortune, for their greed. And now, without knowing how or why, she was his only lifeline. The day after her startling conversation with Frank, Rachel began her routine as though nothing had changed. Her demeanor was calm, professional, and detached, the perfect mask for someone trying to blend into a household teeming with silent tension. But beneath the surface, every fiber of her being was attuned to the undercurrents around her. The stakes had shifted, and Rachel was playing a game she hadn't signed up for. The Rufus siblings, Ross and Monica, made a habit of appearing at odd intervals, always impeccably dressed, their interactions with their father painfully rehearsed. "Good morning, Father," Monica cooed one day, brushing her manicured fingers over Frank's unresponsive hand. Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes were devoid of warmth. "I trust Miss Green is taking excellent care of you?" Rachel stood at the corner of the room, her smile polite but forced. "Mr. Rufus is in stable condition," she replied, keeping her words as neutral as possible. Ross lingered near the door, his arms crossed, his eyes sweeping the room like a predator sizing up its prey. "We're grateful for your dedication, Miss Green," he said, though the edge in his voice felt like a warning rather than gratitude. Frank's stillness was a facade, but it was unnerving even to Rachel. She knew he was listening, calculating every move. And yet, each time his children visited, Rachel couldn't help but notice the slight flicker in his expression, a mixture of anger and determination hidden beneath his blank stare. When the siblings finally left, Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Frank's eyes slowly opened, and his gaze locked onto hers. "They're growing suspicious," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel nodded, her heart thundering in her chest. "They're watching me too," she admitted. "I can feel it." Frank's lips curled into a grim smile. "That's why we must act quickly." That evening, Rachel sat in her quarters, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The day's events played in her mind like fragments of a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. Every interaction, every glance exchanged between Ross and Monica felt laden with unspoken malice. And yet, she had no proof, only the word of a man whose life hung in the balance. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, Frank's trusted housekeeper, an older woman named Clara, stood there, her expression a mix of apprehension and urgency. "Miss Green," Clara began, her voice low, "Mr. Rufus asked me to bring you this." She handed Rachel a small envelope before quickly retreating down the hall. Inside the second envelope was a note scrawled in Frank's shaky handwriting. "Meet me tonight, midnight, my study." Rachel's pulse quickened. Midnight. The hour felt laden with risk, but she knew she couldn't refuse. The man she had once thought to be a helpless invalid was proving to be anything but. The mansion was a labyrinth of shadows as Rachel made her way to Frank's study. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, their silence punctuated only by the faint creaks of the old house. She clutched a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness as she navigated her way. When she reached the study, she hesitated. The heavy wooden door loomed before her like the entrance to another world. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and stepped inside. Frank sat in a wheelchair, his frail figure bathed in the golden glow of a desk lamp. He looked up as she entered, his sharp eyes glinting with resolve. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steadier than she expected. Rachel closed the door behind her, her unease mounting. "What's this about?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Hey!" Frank gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. "Evidence," he said simply. "I've been keeping track of my children's activities for years. Bank records, forged signatures, even emails. They've left a trail, Miss Green. They think they've been careful, but greed always makes people sloppy." Rachel approached the desk, her eyes scanning the documents, the numbers, the transactions. It was damning, and yet a pang of guilt gnawed at her. She wasn't a detective or a spy. She was a nurse who had walked into a storm far bigger than herself. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Frank's gaze was unyielding. "Help me bring this to the authorities, but first, we need more." "More?" Rachel echoed, incredulous. "This isn't enough." Frank shook his head. "They'll deny everything, claim it's a misunderstanding. We need something undeniable, something that will destroy their plans before they destroy me." Rachel left the study feeling more conflicted than ever. The man she had sworn to care for now relied on her, not just for his health, but for his survival in a war against his own blood. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave, to walk away from the chaos that wasn't hers to bear. And yet, the image of Frank's desperate eyes haunted her. The next day, as she moved through the mansion, she began to notice the cracks in its pristine facade. The way Monica's smile faltered when she thought no one was watching, the way Ross lingered just a moment too long outside her quarters, the hushed arguments that echoed faintly through the halls. One afternoon, as Rachel tended to Frank, Monica appeared unannounced. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her presence a sudden chill in the room. "How is he?" Monica asked, her voice deceptively sweet. Rachel forced a smile. "The same as always," she replied, her tone neutral. Monica's eyes narrowed slightly, as though searching for something beneath Rachel's words. Good, she said finally. Keep it that way. As she left, Rachel felt a surge of unease. They knew. Somehow, they knew she was more than just a nurse. That night, as Rachel lay in bed, sleep eluded her. The mansion's silence felt oppressive, every creak and groan of the old house magnified in the stillness. The weight of her promise to Frank bore down on her, but so did the growing sense of danger. The Rufus siblings were not just wealthy, they were ruthless. And Rachel was no longer an outsider, she was a threat. For the first time, she questioned whether she could win this game, but as the first rays of dawn crept through her window, Rachel made her decision. She wouldn't run, she wouldn't back down. The storm was coming, and Rachel was ready to face it. The air in the Rufus mansion was electric, charged with the weight of secrets that had been simmering for far too long. Rachel moved through the corridors with a renewed sense of purpose, her heart a drumbeat of determination. She clutched the small recorder in her pocket, its presence a reminder of the evidence she had gathered, a damning conversation between Ross and Monica that revealed the full extent of their treachery. But even with the recorder, the fight was far from over. Rachel had seen enough courtroom dramas to know how slippery the wealthy could be, their influence bending the truth like light through a prism. They would deny, manipulate, and deflect. And so, she needed something undeniable, a confrontation so raw and public that even Ross and Monica's power couldn't shield them. In Frank's room, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The old man sat upright in his wheelchair, his frail body a sharp contrast to the fire in his eyes. He had shed the mask of helplessness he had worn for years, revealing a man hardened by betrayal, but still clinging to the hope of justice. "They think I'm weak," Frank rasped, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "They think I've already lost." Rachel knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "They've underestimated you," she said, her tone resolute. "We're going to show them who you really are." Frank's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. "It's not just about me anymore," he murmured. "It's about making sure they can't hurt anyone else, ever again." Rachel nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for the man before her. Despite his vulnerability, Frank's spirit remained unbroken. It was a reminder of why she had stayed, why she had risked so much. This wasn't just a job anymore, it was a battle for the truth. The opportunity presented itself during one of Ross and Monica's routine visits. The siblings arrived that afternoon, their polished appearances and feigned concern as carefully curated as ever. Monica glided into the room first, her heels clicking against the marble floor, followed closely by Ross, whose sharp eyes darted around as though searching for cracks in their perfect facade. "Good afternoon, Father," Monica said sweetly, leaning over to adjust the blanket draped across Frank's lap. Her smile was as hollow as the words that followed. "We've been thinking about you a lot lately." Ross chimed in, his tone measured and diplomatic. "We hope you're comfortable, Father. Miss Green has been doing an excellent job, hasn't she?" Rachel stood at her usual spot near the window, her heart pounding as she prepared for what was about to unfold. She glanced at Frank, who met her gaze with a barely perceptible nod. "Actually," Frank began, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "I've been more awake than you think." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like a stone dropped into still water. Monica froze, her hand hovering mid-air, while Ross's expression morphed from smug indifference to stunned disbelief. "Father," Monica stammered, her voice laced with forced laughter. "What are you talking about?" Frank's gaze hardened, his frail hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I know everything, Monica. I know about the forged documents, the secret bank accounts, the plans to have me declared unfit to manage my own affairs." Roz took a step forward, his mask of calm cracking under the pressure. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice sharp. "Who's been feeding you these lies? Miss Green?" Rachel stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline surging through her. "They're not lies," she said, holding up the recorder. "This has everything. The threats, the schemes, the proof of what you've been planning." Monica's face twisted with rage, her composure evaporating like mist under the morning sun. "You little—" she began, but Ross cut her off, his voice cold and calculated. "This is absurd," he sneered. "Even if you had something, no one would believe the word of a nurse over ours." At that moment, the door opened and 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the room, their presence filling the space with undeniable authority. Ross and Monica froze, their eyes darting between the officers and the incriminating recorder in Rachel's hand. Frank leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice firm despite his obvious frailty. "I'm done being your victim," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of pain and betrayal. "You wanted me gone, but now it's your turn to answer for what you've done." The officers moved quickly, reading Ross and Monica their rights as they protested and pleaded. Ross's carefully crafted demeanor chattered, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't do this, we're Rofeses. This is a mistake." Monica, meanwhile, turned her fury on Rachel. "You don't understand," she hissed. "That money, it was supposed to be ours. We deserved it after everything he put us through." Rachel stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "What you deserve is justice," she replied, her voice cutting through Monica's venom. As the siblings were escorted out of the room, the weight of their presence lifted, leaving behind a palpable sense of relief. Rachel turned to Frank, who had slumped back in his chair, his face a mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph. "You did it," Rachel said softly, kneeling beside him. "You stood up to them." Frank's eyes filled with tears, his voice breaking as he replied, "No, Rachel, we did it. I couldn't have done this without you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media attention. The Rufus siblings' downfall became the talk of the town, their once untouchable empire now a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. Frank, though weary, found solace in the fact that his fight was over. He could finally rest, knowing that the truth had prevailed. Rachel, too, found herself changed by the experience. She had stepped into the Rufus mansion as a nurse, but she had left it as something far more, a protector, an advocate, a friend. And as she watched Frank smile for the first time in years, she knew that this battle, as harrowing as it had been, was worth every moment. In the end, the truth had not only exposed the villains, but it also revealed the strength and resilience of a man who refused to be broken, and the woman who stood by his side. The mansion's silence was deceptive, its sprawling halls concealing a storm that had yet to fully break. Rachel knew the stakes had never been higher. Ross and Monica were gone, their arrest marking the first step toward justice, but their greed and desperation hadn't vanished with them. She could feel it in the tension that lingered, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer at night, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Frank's life hung in a precarious balance, and Rachel's resolve was unshakable. She had promised to protect him, and she intended to keep that promise no matter what. But the Rufus siblings weren't finished, not by a long shot. It was late, the kind of deep, velvety darkness where even whispers seemed too loud. Rachel sat by Frank's bedside, reading aloud from a worn novel. Her voice, calm and steady, seemed to soothe him, his breathing even and rhythmic despite the long day. Just as she reached the final chapter, a sound broke through the stillness, a faint creak, barely audible, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It was nothing, she told herself, probably just the old house settling, but then it came again, this time closer. Her heart began to pound, her nurse's instinct screaming at her to act. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Frank, her voice barely audible. His eyes opened wide with fear, but he nodded weakly. Rachel stood and moved toward the door, her steps light and deliberate. She pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear. A faint shuffle of feet confirmed her worst fears. Someone was in the house. Rachel's mind raced. The security system should have kept intruders out, and the guards were stationed at every entrance. Whoever was here knew the mansion well, and that left only one possibility: Monica. She grabbed a nearby lamp, its weight reassuring in her hands, and stepped out into the dimly lit hallway. The soft glow of the sconces cast eerie shadows, turning familiar surroundings into a landscape of uncertainty. As she moved, the sound of footsteps grew louder, more distinct. And then she saw her. Monica stood at the end of the hallway, her once pristine appearance disheveled, her eyes wild with rage. In her hands was a pillow, clutched tightly as if it were both a weapon and a shield. "Monica," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm, "it's over. You can't win this." Monica let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing unnaturally in the stillness. "You think this is about winning?" she spat. "This is about justice. My father never cared about us, only his precious fortune. He deserves this." Rachel took a step forward, her grip tightening on the lamp. "What he deserves is protection, and so do you, Monica. This doesn't have to end like this." But Monica's expression hardened, her lips curling into a snarl. "Don't pretend you care," she hissed. "You're just another pawn in his game. But I'll finish this. Tonight." Monica lunged toward Frank's room, her movements erratic but fueled by a desperate determination. Rachel reacted instinctively, stepping into Monica's path and raising the lamp. The two women collided, their struggle a flurry of motion and sound that shattered the mansion's eerie calm. "Move!" Monica screamed, her voice raw with fury. She began, her voice filled with disbelief. "I can't accept this." "You can, and you will," Frank interrupted, his tone firmer than she had ever heard it. "Rachel, you didn't just save my life. You gave me a second chance to do something meaningful with it, and I want you to be a part of that." The paper in her hands was no ordinary document. It was a will, amended to make Rachel the primary beneficiary of a substantial portion of Frank's wealth. But it wasn't the money itself that stunned her. It was the trust he had placed in her to carry forward the legacy he believed in. "I don't need this," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't do this for money, Frank. I did it because it was the right thing to do." "I know that," Frank replied, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's exactly why I trust you with this. I've spent my life building an empire, but I've realized that wealth means nothing without purpose. I want you to use this to build something good, something that outlives both of us." Rachel looked at him, her heart pounding. She thought of all the lives she had touched as a nurse, the countless faces of those who had needed care but couldn't afford it. The vision was as clear as the sunlight pouring through the windows. A clinic, a sanctuary for those without means, a place where compassion outweighed profit. "A clinic," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "A place where people can get care no matter who they are or what they have." Frank's smile widened, his face lighting up with something akin to hope. "Exactly," he said. "Let that be our legacy, Rachel. Let's build something that matters." Rachel knelt beside Frank's chair, taking his hand in hers. "I promise you," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I'll make it happen. I'll build this clinic, and it'll stand as a testament to everything you've overcome." Frank's hand tightened around hers, his eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, not just for saving my life, but for giving it meaning again. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe itself paused to acknowledge the bond between them. It was a bond forged not of blood, but of trust, sacrifice, and shared purpose. The mansion, once a prison of greed and deceit, now felt like the birthplace of something beautiful. The days that followed were filled with plans and possibilities. Rachel and Frank spent hours discussing the future, their conversations infused with a sense of urgency and hope. Frank's health, though fragile, seemed buoyed by his renewed purpose. And Rachel, for the first time in years, felt a sense of clarity about her own path. When Frank finally passed, it was peaceful, his hand in Rachel's, his last words a quiet reminder. "Promise me you'll keep helping others." "I promise," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face. In the months that followed, Rachel made good on that promise. The clinic she built, named Haven House in honor of Frank's journey, became a beacon of hope for countless families. Its doors were always open, its walls filled with the laughter and gratitude of those who had found solace within. And though Frank was gone, his spirit lingered, not in the mansion he had left behind, but in the lives he had touched through Rachel. Together, they had transformed a legacy of greed into a legacy of compassion, proving that even in the darkest of places, light could find a way to shine. Rachel stood outside the clinic one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. As the golden light bathed the building, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. She wasn't just a nurse, or a hero, or the inheritor of a fortune. She was a protector of hope, a keeper of promises, and a testament to the power of doing what's right. And in her heart, she knew Frank would be proud. The land that Rachel chose for the clinic was a quiet, sunlit plot on the outskirts of the city, a place where life seemed to breathe a little easier. It wasn't grand or luxurious. It didn't need to be. What mattered was the promise it held, the dream it carried. To Rachel, the ground itself felt alive, whispering of second chances, of healing, and of hope. She stood there on the first day of construction, her heart swelling as she watched the earth move beneath the machines, the soil churning like the beginning of a new story. Frank's voice echoed in her memory, his trust in her as vivid as the sunlight warming her face. "Let this be our legacy." He shook his head, a small, almost wistful smile curving his lips. "No, Rachel. You were my anchor in a storm that I felt would drown me. You gave me a reason to believe again." The moments stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Finally, Frank reached for the envelope that sat on the table beside his bed. His hands, trembling but deliberate, passed it to Rachel. "What is this?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Frank's smile deepened, though it carried the weight of years lost. "My gratitude," he said simply, "and my trust." Rachel opened the envelope, her hand steady despite the thrum of curiosity in her chest. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Not a chance," Rachel shot back, her feet planted firmly as she fought to keep Monica from reaching Frank. The pillow slipped from Monica's hands as she clawed at Rachel, her nails raking against fabric and skin. Rachel gritted her teeth, her strength fueled by sheer willpower. She managed to shove Monica back, the older woman stumbling but quickly recovering. "You don't understand," Monica cried, her voice breaking. He ruined us. Everything we did, everything we are, it is because of him." Rachel's chest heaved as she met Monica's gaze. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Everything you are is because of your choices. And you don't have to keep making the wrong ones." For a moment, Monica hesitated, her expression flickering with something that might have been doubt. But then, with a guttural scream, she lunged again. This time, Rachel was ready. She sidestepped Monica's charge and swung the lamp, the base connecting with the floor, inches from Monica's feet. The noise was deafening and Monica froze, her chest rising and falling as she stared at Rachel with a mix of fear and hatred. Before either could move, the door burst open and 2 security guards stormed in, their presence a sudden wall of authority. They grabbed Monica, her protests loud but futile as they restrained her. You'll regret this," she screamed, her voice echoing down the corridor as they dragged her away. "You're nothing! Nothing!" Rachel stood there, her body trembling with adrenaline as the silence returned. She turned back to Frank's room, where the old man sat upright, his eyes glistening with tears. Rachel knelt beside him, her hands gently resting on his frail ones. "It's over," she said softly, her voice breaking with relief. "You're safe." Frank's lips trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, he squeezed her hand, his gratitude radiating through the simple gesture. For the first time in years, he didn't look like a man burdened by fear or betrayal. He looked free. "You saved my life," Frank finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this, Rachel, never." Rachel shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "You had the strength to fight. I just helped you see it." As she sat with him, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. It felt like the end of a storm, the air lighter, the silence no longer oppressive, but peaceful. Rachel wasn't a hero in her eyes. She was just someone who had refused to look away when someone needed her most. But in that moment, as the sun rose over the Rufus mansion, she knew she had done something extraordinary, not just for Frank, but for herself. She had proven that courage wasn't about fearlessness. It was about standing firm in the face of fear, armed with nothing but determination and compassion. And that, she realized, was more powerful than any fortune. The Rufus mansion, once a fortress of secrets and shadows, now felt lighter, as if the walls themselves exhaled a sigh of relief. The weight that had pressed on the house for years, the greed, the lies, the betrayal, had finally lifted. In the quiet of Frank's room, where the golden light of afternoon streamed through the tall windows, Rachel sat beside the man she had risked everything to protect. Frank Rufus, the once mighty patriarch, looked frail against the grand backdrop of his surroundings, yet in his pale face there was a glow, a quiet strength that refused to be extinguished. He stared at Rachel with eyes filled with something rare and precious. Gratitude, raw and unfiltered. It was a look that needed no words, though words would soon come. "Rachel," Frank began, his voice trembling not with weakness but with emotion, "I owe you more than my life. I owe you my faith. In people, in hope, in goodness." His words hung in the air, as fragile and as profound as a glass figurine. Rachel's throat tightened, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. She wanted to protest, to tell him that she was only doing her job. But she knew this moment was not about her humility. It was about his truth. "You didn't just save me from them," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength like a river finding its course. "You saved me from myself. For years I let their betrayal poison me, let their greed make me believe that all the love in the world was false. But you," he paused, his voice breaking, "you showed me there's still light in this world." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. The foundation was the first to take shape, a blank slate waiting to carry the weight of something bigger than walls and floors. Rachel found herself visiting the site daily, her presence a constant reminder of what this project truly meant. To the workers, she was more than just the funder of the clinic. She was its heartbeat. She walked among them, her words laced with encouragement, her gratitude as steady as the rhythm of hammers striking nails. "This clinic isn't just for patients," Rachel said one morning, her voice carrying over the hum of construction. "It's for everyone who believes in what we're building here. It's for people who need a chance, not just to heal, but to hope." Her words lingered, and for a moment it seemed as though the very walls of the clinic were listening, drawing strength from her resolve. As the structure rose from the ground, Rachel's vision began to take form. The bricks, stacked one by one, felt like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. Each layer seemed to hold more than cement. It held purpose, care, and the whispers of countless dreams that would one day fill these halls. Rachel often stood before the growing structure, imagining the faces of the people who would one day walk through its doors. She saw a mother cradling her feverish child, a man clutching his chest with worry, a teenager limping in after a basketball injury. They weren't strangers to her. They were the reason she woke each morning with fire in her soul. "This clinic is more than walls," she would remind herself, the words becoming a mantra. "It's a sanctuary. It's Frank's trust. It's my promise." The clinic's name was chosen carefully, each word deliberate: Haven House. To Rachel, it was more than a tribute to Frank Rufus. It was a reflection of his transformation. A man who had once been surrounded by shadows and greed had become a beacon of light, his legacy now tied to healing and generosity. As she oversaw the finishing touches, Rachel felt Frank's presence in the smallest details. The wide, welcoming lobby reminded her of his quiet strength. The rooms, painted in soothing tones, carried the hope he had placed in her hands. Even the garden, a small patch of vibrant flowers at the entrance, seemed to echo his final words: "Promise me you'll keep helping others." "This is your house too, Frank," Rachel whispered one afternoon as she stood in the garden, the wind brushing her cheeks like a gentle acknowledgement. "And I'll make sure it lives up to everything you believed it could be." When the clinic was finally complete, Rachel stood before the gathered crowd, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. Patients, volunteers, friends, and strangers alike had come to witness the birth of something extraordinary. Even the air seemed to hum with anticipation, as though the universe itself leaned in to listen. "Today," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest, "we open the doors to Haven House. But this clinic is not just a building, it's a promise. One that began with a man who believed in second chances." Her eyes swept over the crowd, her gaze locking with a young mother holding her baby, an elderly couple leaning on each other for support, a teenager with a cast on his arm. Each face was a reminder of why this day mattered. "Here, you are not just patients," Rachel continued, her voice rising with conviction. "You are family, you are valued, and you are never alone." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Rachel barely heard it. Her heart was too full, her thoughts too focused on the people who would soon fill these halls with their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. In the weeks that followed, Haven House came alive, its walls no longer silent but filled with the sounds of healing. Rachel moved through the clinic like its very soul, her presence reassuring, her compassion limitless. Patients often stopped her in the halls to thank her, their words simple but profound. "You've given us hope," one man said, his voice cracking with emotion. Rachel smiled, her own eyes misting. "No," she replied, "you've reminded me why it matters." She worked tirelessly, her energy fueled by a deep sense of purpose. But it wasn't just the patients who inspired her. It was the memory of Frank Rufus, His faith in her had ignited something she hadn't realized she possessed: the power to change lives, one person at a time. Rachel's favorite place in the clinic was the garden. It was small but vibrant, a splash of color and life amid the concrete. She often found herself sitting there after long days, watching as the flowers swayed gently in the breeze. To her, the garden was more than a patch of plants. It was a metaphor for everything she and Frank had built together. Just as the flowers needed care and patience to thrive, so too did the lives that passed through Haven House. And just as the garden grew toward the sunlight, so too did the people who came here seeking hope. "This is just the beginning," Rachel would whisper to herself, her gaze fixed on the horizon, and in her heart, she knew she was right. The work was far from over, but neither was the joy it brought. Every brick of Haven House, every flower in the garden, every life touched within its walls was a testament to the bond between Rachel and Frank. Their story, one of trust, sacrifice, and transformation, had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Rachel often thought of Frank during quiet moments, his voice a gentle reminder of the promise she had made. And though he was gone, his spirit lived on, not just in the clinic, but in the hope it brought to the world. As Rachel walked through the halls of Haven House, her heart full and her steps light, she knew one thing for certain: this was more than a clinic. It was a home. It was a haven. It was proof that even in the darkest of times, light could find a way to shine. The morning Frank passed felt strangely serene, as though the universe itself had paused to honor his final moments. The sunlight streaming through the window wrapped him in a golden embrace, soft and warm, like a farewell kiss from the heavens. The room was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the ventilator, a rhythm that had become a lullaby for Rachel over the months. Frank lay peacefully in his bed, his frail hands resting on the blanket that covered him. His breaths were shallow, each one a delicate thread tethering him to the world. Rachel sat by his side, her fingers gently clasping his, as if to remind him he wasn't alone. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but his words carried the weight of 1,000 goodbyes. "Promise me you'll keep helping others." "I promise," Rachel replied, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was firm. "I'll honor everything you stood for." Frank's eyes closed slowly, a peaceful smile gracing his lips. The sunlight seemed to grow brighter, filling the room with an almost divine glow, as though his spirit was rising, leaving behind the burdens of this life. Rachel felt the loss deeply, like a quiet ache that settled into her soul. But as she looked out the window at the blooming garden of Haven House, she knew Frank was still there, in every life touched, every dream fulfilled, and every hope rekindled. His legacy would live on, not in stone or wealth, but in the countless hearts forever changed by his trust and generosity. Frank Rufus was gone, yet his presence lingered in every corner of Haven House. The walls seemed to hum with his unwavering resolve. The garden outside bloomed as if nourished by his quiet strength, and the halls carried the gentle echo of his final wish: "Promise me you'll keep helping others." Rachel felt his legacy not as a burden, but as a gift, a torch passed from one hand to another, burning brightly with purpose. Every patient who entered the clinic, every life touched, was a testament to the man who had chosen compassion over bitterness, trust over fear. And Rachel in turn poured her heart into the work, ensuring that his sacrifice became a foundation for countless others to stand upon. In the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the world seemed to hold its breath, Rachel would sit in the garden, surrounded by the beauty Frank had inspired. She would close her eyes and feel the warmth of his belief in her, as steady as the earth beneath her feet. Frank's legacy wasn't just a clinic. It was a promise fulfilled, A light passed from one generation to the next, illuminating the path for those who dared to dream of a better world. Through Rachel, his spirit lived on, a quiet force of kindness, transforming the lives of strangers into family.